Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill. Here are the questions that will be covered in this presentation. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill is regarded as one of the largest environmental disasters in American history. That was caused by the explosion in the oil rig on April 20, 2010. The Deepwater Horizon rig was owned and operated by offshore oil drilling company Transocean, and leased by oil company BP, was located in the Gulf of Mexico. The explosion and subsequent fire resulted in the sinking of the Deepwater Horizon, and the deaths of 11 workers, 17 others were injured. The same blowout that caused the explosion also caused an oil well fire, and a massive offshore oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. While the exact measure of spilled oil is unknown, the spill was at least 4.9 million barrels and is considered the largest accidental marine oil spill in the world. After numerous failed efforts to contain the flow, the well was declared sealed on September 19, 2010, in 87 days after the explosion. So what happened? It was identified that the Deepwater Horizon exposure happened due to failures of blowout preventer and cement. Transocean has had problems previously with both cement seals and blowout preventers, however no lessons were learned and nothing was done. The company was intentionally saving on safety and therefore did nothing to prevent incidents in future. So the disaster was caused by engineering and management failures. So, how it started. Every rig operator aware that before a rig can unhook from a drilled pipe, the operator has to run a negative pressure test to make sure the cement has properly sealed the drill pipe. If the pipe is safely plugged, the pressure gauge will read 0. The amount of pressure BP measured on the day of the explosion was 1,400 pound-force per square inch, not 0. By reporting that the pipe had no pressure and all was safe, BP could begin to unhook the Deepwater Horizon from the pipe and sail away. It would cost BP about $500,000 each extra day the rig stays on top of the drill hole. It seems that BP wanted the rig gone in quickly. Once the process started, several failures occurred. Look at the illustration from the bottom to top. The cement that was supposed to stop oil and gas reaching the well didn't work as was not strong enough. The valve at the bottom of the drilled pipe failed as well. The blowout preventer also failed. Automated shutdown wouldn't work as blowout preventer had flat batteries in one control pod, faulty valve in another, and wrong wiring in several parts of the equipment. Oil and gas were now pouring up the well, but it took around 50 minutes for this to be noticed by the workers. The oil and gas vented directly to the rig where it ignited. The rig had an onboard gas detection system that should have sounded the alarm and triggered the closure of ventilation fans to prevent the gas reaching potential causes of ignition, such as the rig's engines. The system failed. The heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system moved gas mixtures into the engine room and caused 2 huge explosions that took lives of 11 crew members. At the same time, a large oil slick began to spread at the former rig site and resulted in the largest environmental disaster in American history. The oil flowed for 87 days because there was not an emergency plan, and it took about 3 months just to figure out how to seal the oil flow. However, oil continued to sink to the ocean floor for more than a year after. The emergency response to the oil spill was extremely slow. There was lots of confusion about who was the responsible party for the oil cleanup, which doctrines and standards to use, and who needs to be involved into the emergency response actions. Such confusion and overlapping laws lead to valuable time loss. It was identified that the spill directly affected 68,000 square miles of ocean and directly impacted marine life, ecosystem, and economy of affected areas. The other serious concern is that the cleanup crew is dramatically affected. There were around 50,000 people involved in the oil cleanup project. Numerous of workers were hospitalized due to heat exposure, dehydration, and exposure to the spills and cleaning products toxins. cleanup workers reported similar symptoms such as eye, nose, throat, and skin irritations, respiratory problems, vomit, seizures, nausea, short-term memory loss, and confusion. Central nervous system effects and miscarriages. Chronic adverse health effects to such exposure are cancers, liver and kidney disease, mental health disorders, birth defects, and developmental disorders. An independent investigation showed that BP did not hand out the legally required safety manual for used cleanup products, and workers were not provided with safety training or protective gear. In addition, according to the workers' reports, they were not even allowed to use respirators, and that their jobs were threatened if they did. In the result, we can only imagine how many lives were affected and died in the result of exposure during the oil spill cleanup project. The biggest gap in the emergency management in this incident is the lack of emergency management. You can see on the screen that there were countless failures, and each of those dramatically contributed into the severity of the events. Here are a few of them. One of major cause of the explosion were weak cement and failure of the blowout preventer. In fact, the company was aware of those problems. New formula cement had previously failed some testing, and very outdated blowout preventer that they used had similar failures in past. As a part of an emergency prevention program, those red flags should not have been ignored, and correction actions had to be put in place. Also, according to the Alberta legislation, the employer had to develop and implement safe work practices that include worker training, including hazard recognition, inspection and maintenance of equipment. Workers also must be competent. Several reports confirm that workers were not properly trained to work on the oil rig and were not able to recognize signs that lead to upcoming catastrophic incident. Complying with those standards could prevent the exposure. BP also had no evacuation plan exists and didn't have an emergency escape route. Employees also were not trained on what to do in case of blowout. Therefore, they had to use their survival skills to survive and jumped off the rig into ocean when explosion happened. As a part of emergency response, BP had to have developed an organized disaster plan of what to do and how to stop oil leak. They didn't have such plan, and it took 87 days to finally seal the leak. In fact, it was still leaking after. This unpreparedness led to economical and ecological disaster caused by the catastrophic oil spill. When the oil spill cleanup program started, workers were not provided with PPE, and therefore numerous of them had developed numerous of long-term diseases, including cancer, due to exposure to toxins. If the proper protective gear was provided at first place, the tragic consequences could be avoided. And according to Part 1 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, workers are obligated to ensure health and safety and welfare of the workers. However, BP ensured that their pockets full, and they were intentionally saving on safety. What might I have done differently? First of all, I would not allow any of the stated in the previous slide gaps happen. I would also implement strict regulations for how often testing and inspecting equipment should be done. I would make sure that roles and responsibilities in case of emergency are clearly stated and understood by each employee, including management level. I would make sure that the company knows which standard to follow in case of the emergency report. This must be done through the communication with the government and the government's agencies. If I was the government, I would make sure to put emergency response guidance and identify a specific doctrine that should be followed in case of few states are an affected area. OceanIOSH's response to the oil spill was the following. Government staff visited work sites day by day, distinguishing hazards and methods for reduction. Evaluated training projects to guarantee that laborers were satisfactorily prepared in languages they could comprehend. Checked substance presentations and discovered that the correct individual defensive hardware was conveyed, insisted on implementation of a heat mitigation program, and conducted extensive outreach in communities impacted by the spill. The Unified Command provided a structure for agencies from across the federal government to work together, fostering collaboration between a range of agencies with public health and worker protection responsibilities. BP was also obligated to implement a safety and health program consistent with OSHA standards, assigned an industrial hygienist team to monitor for potential worker chemical exposures at staging areas, insisted that respiratory precautions were important for workers engaging in decontamination operations or working near the source of the oil spill, Implement a program to protect workers from the heat illnesses. The program included work rest requirements, shaded rest areas, hydration liquids, and on-site heat monitoring. A new agency, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, BSE, was created to track and enforce offshore drilling safety issues, something that had been handled by the same agency that approved leases to oil companies. It was also announced a new set of safety rules for offshore operations in 2016. Among those rules was one that required blowout protectors, the piece that had failed at Deepwater Horizon, to be inspected by a third party, rather than self-certified by the drilling companies. Later on, it was required to pass the government's inspections. Did their corrective actions fill the gaps? It could. However, many of the rules, as well as other safety practices put in place after the disaster, have been weakened in recent years. Most notably, in 2019 the Trump administration finalized rollbacks of several components of the 2016 rules, including the independent safety certification for blowout protectors and bi-weekly testing. The new government allowed drillers to use third-party companies instead of government inspectors to check equipment, and gave them more time between inspections. Trump's administration expects to save the oil industry more than $824 million over the next 10 years. It seems things got back to 2010. We only left to hope that such incidents will not occur again.